So for 40 years, the world's greatest superpower has tried to basically crush a nation's economy into dust. And, they're operating on this very linear, seemingly logical assumption, right? Which is if you apply enough external pressure, if you just starve a system of capital and trade, the system will eventually crack.
Right. The idea is that the government will either collapse under its own weight or the population will rise up and demand integration into the global order. That's the standard theory.
Exactly. I mean, we look at the news, we see a country placed under heavy economic sanctions, and we expect that clean, predictable result. But today, for you listening, we're taking a deep dive into the bizarre, totally unintended consequences of those global sanctions. Because when you put a country under a total economic siege for 4 decades, it doesn't necessarily break.
No, it really doesn't. Sometimes it actually mutates. It turns into this bulletproof, self-sustaining fortress. It's this really fascinating paradox of modern global politics.
Yeah, it really is. And welcome to today's deep dive, by the way. If you are joining us to cut through the noise and understand the mechanics of how the world actually works beneath the headlines, you are in exactly the right place. Today's mission is to unpack an extensive body of political economy research focusing on what the sources call contender states.
Right, and we're taking a really deep structural look at Iran specifically today with some comparative notes on Russia. The source text explores how extreme external pressure literally reshapes everything. I mean, it changes a society's welfare state, its economy, its physical geography, and even its culture.
It's massive. But before we really start mapping this out, we should probably establish some parameters for our discussion today. Because the sources we're analyzing, they deal with some highly charged political realities.
Yeah, very charged. We're talking about U.S. foreign policy, the Iranian government, and some really intense domestic factional battles.
Right. And that is a vital point for you listening. We are absolutely not taking sides here, nor are we endorsing the specific viewpoints, policies, or ideologies of any of the governments involved. Our only objective today is to impartially report on the content provided in the research.
Exactly. We're just exploring the mechanisms and the theories that the authors present. We're simply here to convey the ideas contained in the original source material and, try to figure out how they all fit together.
Perfectly said. So to understand the mechanics of this mutation we're talking about, the text asks us to zoom out first. We need to look at the global chessboard. And the researchers rely on this foundational theoretical divide to explain the modern political economy.
Yeah, they divide the world into two main spheres. You have the Lockean heartland on one side and then the Hobbesian contender states on the other.
Okay, Lockean and Hobbesian. Those are some heavy philosophical terms, but they actually make perfect sense when you map them to global economics.
They do, yeah. So the Lockean heartland refers to the United States and the broader Western capitalist hegemony. John Locke's philosophy was deeply rooted in the idea of a property-owning class governing itself.
Right, which translates today to global market governance, free trade, and neoliberal economics. It's basically a system designed to open up borders and integrate economies.
Exactly. The goal is to align every state with liberal global governance. But on the opposing side, you have the Hobbesian contender states. Thomas Hobbes argued that human survival in a chaotic world requires a strong, centralized, absolute sovereign power.
Right, because otherwise it's just the war of all against all. So in this framework, contender states, and the text specifically points to Russia and Iran here, they are nations that centralize their power to actively resist the gravitational pull of that Lockean heartland.
Yeah, they adopt a highly defensive posture. They pull all their power inward, creating this hard shell to protect their sovereignty against what they perceive as an aggressive, ever-expanding Western economic order.
And the primary weapon that the Lockean heartland uses to try and crack open those Hobbesian shells is sanctions. But the text frames sanctions as something much more complex than just, blocking a trade route. They call them neo-protectionism.
That distinction is so critical here because we aren't just talking about a tariff on imported steel or an embargo on a specific raw material. Modern sanctions are incredibly sophisticated.
Right. There are these extraterritorial legal frameworks that basically weaponize the United States dollar, right, to disrupt global supply chains.
Yes, exactly. The U.S. uses its exorbitant privilege, which is the reality that the global financial system routes almost entirely through its currency and its clearinghouses, like SWIFT. And they use that to basically dictate corporate behavior globally.
Meaning it's not just the U.S. refusing to trade with Iran. Like if a French bank processes a transaction for an Iranian company, or if a Chinese telecom giant uses U.S. components and gear sold to a sanctioned state,
The U.S. can cut that French bank or that Chinese company completely off from the U.S. financial system. They use access to the dollar as a club, and that invisible hand is devastatingly effective at isolating a nation.
Wow. Yeah, and the research illustrates this isolation by looking at the distribution of global wealth, right?
Right.
Because transnational corporations, mostly from the U.S. and China, completely dominate wealth creation.
They do. If you look at the Forbes top 2,000 companies around 2017, U.S. tech and banks, alongside Chinese state banks, hold this massive lion's share of global profit. Russian companies made up a meager 1 or 2% of that total profit pool.
And Iranian firms were completely absent, like 0%. They are entirely cut off from the transnational networks that generate the modern world's wealth.
Completely cut off, which is exactly the goal of the sanctions.
But wait, let me push back on the fundamental logic of this strategy for a second.
Yeah.
If the stated goal of sanctions is to force a government to open up its economy or step down, to essentially make it change its behavior and integrate, aren't these extraterritorial sanctions achieving the exact opposite?
How do you mean?
Well, by putting a country under this total economic siege, you're basically handing the government the absolute perfect justification to lock down, centralize all their resources, and go full Hobbesian, aren't you?
Your pushback hits on the absolute central paradox identified in the text. You're exactly right. Sanctions absolutely inflict profound short-term economic pain. I mean, they disrupt trade, fuel inflation, create immediate shortages.
Right, which hurts the everyday people.
Massively. But over the span of decades, they failed to induce regime change because they literally forced the target state to develop counter-hegemonic mechanisms.
Counter-hegemonic mechanisms, meaning tools built specifically to survive against the dominant global power.
Yes. Because when a state is forcibly severed from the global market, it has no choice but to ruthlessly optimize its domestic resources. It has to create internal resilience just to survive.
So the state centralizes power, not just out of some ideological desire to be authoritarian, but out of sheer logistical necessity. They are forced to become completely self-reliant.
Exactly. Which means if external trade is blocked and you don't have transnational corporations bringing in offshore wealth, the state's survival hinges entirely on its ability to maintain domestic loyalty.
Right, because if the government can't keep the population fed, housed, and healthy, the entire fortress just collapses from within.
Precisely. And that survival imperative drives a complete re-engineering of the social contract. The text provides a really stark historical contrast to illustrate this shift in Iran.
Let's talk about that contrast. Because before the 1979 Islamic Revolution, Iran was ruled by the Pahlavi monarchy. And their welfare system was, well, it was highly exclusionary.
Very exclusionary. It was a top-down bureaucratic model that essentially functioned as a VIP club. It was for the elite, the military, and a very narrow segment of industrial workers.
Leaving the vast majority of the rural and urban poor completely marginalized, just totally on their own.
Yeah, completely. But when the Islamic Republic was established in 1979, they couldn't afford to be exclusionary. They were suddenly facing massive internal demands for social justice from a highly mobilized revolutionary population.
And almost immediately, they were plunged into a devastating 8-year war with Iraq. And that was followed by the permanent onset of these international sanctions. So to survive all that, they had to build a system that kept every single citizen bought into the project of the nation.
Right. But they couldn't build a standard monolithic welfare state like you might see in Scandinavia because post-revolutionary power in Iran was incredibly diffused. There were all these different factions.
So what did they do?
Instead, they built what the researchers call a dual welfare regime.
Okay, let's break down the mechanics of that dual system because this is fascinating.
Yeah.
On one track, you have the official state-run organizations, primarily the Social Security Organization, or SSO.
Yeah, and the SSO functions somewhat traditionally. It covers workers in public institutions and large private companies through a standard contributory system. You pay in, you get benefits.
Right. But the second track is where the system completely mutates. You have these massive para-governmental religious charities known as bonyads.
Yes, the bonyads. And they are arguably the most critical load-bearing pillars of this entire Hobbesian fortress. The text highlights the Imam Khomeini Relief Committee, the IKRC, as a prime example here.
And these organizations operate parallel to the state apparatus, right? Providing non-contributory welfare.
Exactly, non-contributory. That means a citizen doesn't have to formally pay into a tax system or hold a corporate job to receive benefits from them.
So they function as a massive shadow welfare state aimed directly at the most vulnerable people in society. The text notes the IKRC provides pensions for elderly farmers in deep rural areas, for example.
Yeah, and they fund approximately 10% of the health insurance needed for anti-poverty transfers.
Yeah.
And the scale of generosity within this dual system is just staggering, especially when you look at the pension ages.
Oh my gosh, the pension ages. This blew my mind. The average retirement age cited in the research is 55.3. But even more surprisingly, women and men with 30 years of employment history can retire at 45 and 50, respectively.
Right. When you compare that to the Lockean heartland, where, retirement ages are steadily pushing towards 65 or 67, it highlights this radical commitment to social protection.
A retirement age of 45.
Yeah.
That is wild. And this push for self-sufficiency extended heavily into physical infrastructure and healthcare too, didn't it?
It did. The text points to the construction of 1,500 hospitals with 140,000 beds.
But the pharmaceutical pivot is the statistic that really underscores this counter-hegemonic resilience for me. Before 1979, Iran imported 80% of its medication.
Right. Then today.
Today, honestly rather, because of 40 years of sanctions choking off their access to global supply chains, domestic producers cover 97% of the country's medication needs. 97%.
It's an incredible logistical achievement. To do a pivot like that, the state had to engage in aggressive, directed import substitution. They subsidized local laboratories. They imported raw, active pharmaceutical ingredients from non-aligned nations.
And they basically just ignored international intellectual property regimes to reverse engineer essential drugs, right?
Exactly. They had to. The World Health Organization actually went so far as to characterize the creation of their universal rural healthcare network during the Iran-Iraq War as an incredible masterpiece of public health logistics.
That is high praise from the WHO.
Yeah.
But let's look at the math here for a second, because the underlying mechanism seems mathematically impossible to sustain.
Oh, it absolutely is.
Right. Because if a worker can retire at 45, drawing a pension for perhaps another 30 or 40 years, and the state is simultaneously funding this massive parallel shadow welfare system through the boneyards,
Yep.
all while the macroeconomy is being suffocated by international sanctions. How does the Treasury avoid total collapse? Just doesn't make sense.
Well, think of it as a demographic Ponzi scheme. Though, one born out of historical necessity rather than financial malice, the text is very clear that this incredible level of social protection is currently driving the system toward impending bankruptcy.
Okay, so how did they end up in a demographic Ponzi scheme? The text points to the population dynamics of the past 4 decades, right?
Yes. Specifically, the baby boom of the 1980s. Following the revolution, the massive expansion of public health policies and the ideological push for a larger nation contributed to this massive spike in births.
Right, they wanted a huge generation to build a new nation and fight the war. But the state quickly realized the carrying capacity of their sanctioned economy could never actually support that trajectory of population growth, right?
Exactly. They saw the writing on the wall. So they completely reversed course and implemented one of the most effective family planning networks in modern history.
A drop from an average of 7 children per mother down to just 2 in a single generation. That is almost mathematically unprecedented without extreme coercion. What levers did the state pull to make that happen so rapidly?
It was a fascinating blend of pragmatism and religious authority. Remember that massive rural healthcare network we just discussed? They utilized that.
Okay, so they used the infrastructure they already built.
Yeah. They deployed mobile clinics and these things called health houses to the most remote villages, and they offered free contraception and family planning education.
Wow, free contraception pushed by the state. But how did they get around the religious opposition? Because that usually blocks those kinds of initiatives.
Crucially, they secured religious decrees, fatwas, from high-ranking clerics explicitly permitting these practices. That completely neutralized the religious opposition to birth control.
Okay, so they successfully diffused the population bomb.
Yeah.
But in doing so, they created a structural nightmare for those generous pension funds we were talking about.
Exactly. The early investors in this demographic Ponzi scheme, the workers who built the post-revolutionary state, they are retiring early and demanding their massive payouts.
Right, retiring at 45 or 50. But the base of new investors, the younger generation, has completely crashed due to that super successful family planning.
Yes. The ratio of workers paying into the system versus pensioners pulling money out is just collapsing. International actuarial standards suggest a stable, generous pension system requires about 6 actively contributing workers for every 1 pensioner.
Okay, 6 to 1. And in Iran.
The research shows that ratio has fallen below 1 to 5.
Oh, wow. Less than 1 to 5.
The mathematical reality is just unforgiving. A member of the Majlis, which is the Iranian parliament, testified in 2018 that 18 out of the 24 patient providers in the country were functionally bankrupt.
18 out of 24. So how are they even paying people?
They are relying on constant emergency injections from the central state budget just to cut the checks every month.
So the state achieved this miraculous level of social cohesion to survive a siege, but they essentially mortgaged their entire demographic future to do it.
They really did. And this trap extends far beyond just the pensions. Because to build that self-sufficient Hobbesian fortress, the state knew they needed domestic engineers, doctors, and scientists.
Right. They couldn't hire foreign experts because of the isolation. So they massively expanded free education. But as we see in the text, mass educating a population inside a stagnant, isolated economy created a devastating trap for that exact generation born during the 1980s baby boom.
Yeah, because following the end of the devastating Iran-Iraq War in 1988, millions of veterans returned home. They and their families had shed blood for the revolution, and their fundamental demand was upward social mobility.
They felt they were owed a better life, which is fair. So the state's response was a dramatic democratization of higher education.
Exactly. They didn't just build elite institutions in Tehran, they pushed university infrastructure deep into the rural provinces. The sheer volume of this expansion is incredible.
The numbers in the text are wild. Between 1979 and 2010, the number of universities exploded from 341 to 2,390.
On paper, this looks like the ultimate counter-hegemonic success story. You educate your populace to run the domestic industries you are forced to build because of sanctions.
Right. But the unintended consequence is severe overeducation relative to the economy's absorptive capacity. You hand millions of young people degrees in engineering, architecture, and literature.
But the economy, which is strangled by a lack of foreign investment and struggling with internal bureaucratic inefficiency, just isn't creating engineering or architectural firms for them to work at.
So there are nowhere near enough jobs for all these graduates. The text points out that overall youth unemployment hovered dangerously high, between 25 and 29%. But for university graduates, the unemployment rate spiked to nearly 40%.
Almost half of all university graduates had no jobs. And this unemployment crisis collided violently with some neoliberal economic experiments the government attempted in the 2000s.
Oh, right. Because to try and stimulate domestic growth, the state pushed for privatization in the real estate sector, right?
Yes. They allowed state banks to lend aggressively for construction and property development, which triggered a massive speculative housing bubble.
Because the state essentially turned land and real estate into the only viable avenue for domestic investment. I mean, investing in global markets was illegal under the sanctions, so all the money just flooded into domestic real estate.
Exactly. And because of that, rents in urban centers skyrocketed, completely decoupling from local wages. So you have this youth demographic that is highly educated, deeply unemployed, and now entirely priced out of the housing market.
They literally cannot afford to rent an apartment, which means they cannot afford to get married or start independent lives. They are basically trapped in this extended adolescence, living in their childhood bedrooms well into their 20s and 30s.
But we have to ask, how does that material reality alter the psychology of a generation? The text explores the shift in cultural self-esteem, and it is profound.
It really is. It represents this fundamental fracture in the state's ideological project. Because during the 1980s, amidst the zeal of the revolution and the shared trauma of the war, self-esteem was culturally defined by shared sacrifice.
Right. The ideological currency was martyrdom, heroism, and religious devotion. Poverty was definitely not a source of shame. Actually, the working poor, the Mostazafan, they were heralded as the pure, beating heart of the revolutionary nation.
But the text argues that by the 2000s, those metrics for self-worth had completely shifted.
Totally shifted. Driven by the emergence of a new, highly educated technocratic middle class and the unavoidable, creeping influence of global consumerism, which they accessed through satellite dishes, and later the internet self-esteem became inextricably tied to material success and consumption.
So the standard became, do you own a car? Can you afford a modern apartment? Are you wearing Western brands?
Yes, exactly. Furthermore, the official state discourse subtly mutated along with this. As the government tried to implement more market-driven economic policies, the rhetoric began to individualize economic failure.
Meaning, if you're poor, it's your own fault, not the system's fault.
Precisely. So these young, highly educated, unemployed people aren't just suffering from empty bank accounts. They feel culturally criminalized and shamed for their precarity.
Their self-worth is just battered by a system that promised them upward mobility through education, but delivered a localized economic depression instead.
It's incredibly frustrating for them.
So you have this massive demographic of materially frustrated, highly educated youth. Logically, they desperately need a political outlet to demand systemic change, right?
Absolutely.
But when they look to the political arena to pull the levers of power, they run headfirst into one of the most uniquely complex, gridlocked political systems on Earth.
It really is. It is a system designed specifically to balance competing forces and prevent rapid shifts in direction. And, Western analysis often does a disservice to the listener by flattening Iranian politics into a simple binary.
Right, we always hear it framed as just authoritarian hardliners versus liberal reformers. But the text provides a much more nuanced four-part factional map that proves it is far more complicated than a straight line from left to right.
Let's construct this matrix for the listener, because understanding it is absolutely key to understanding why the economy functions the way it does. It is a two-dimensional grid based on two intersecting axes.
Okay, let's draw it out. The vertical axis represents legitimacy. Basically, who should hold ultimate power? At the top, you have the theocratic view power emanates from divine law, channeled specifically through the absolute authority of the supreme leader.
And at the bottom of that vertical axis, you have the Republican or Democratic view. This argues that power ultimately derives from the consent of the governed through elections and representative bodies.
Okay, so that's top to bottom. Then the horizontal axis represents economics. On the left side of the axis, you have proponents of state control, social justice, extensive welfare, and wealth redistribution.
Right. And they are highly skeptical of free market capitalism and foreign investment. But on the right side of that horizontal axis, you have advocates for economic liberalization, privatization, deregulation, and integration into global markets.
Okay, so when you cross these two axes, you get four highly distinct, fiercely competitive political factions. Let's start in the upper left quadrant, the theocratic left.
Oh.
Who are they?
The theocratic left represents the hardline populists. Politically, they are staunch defenders of the supreme leader's absolute authority and strict cultural conservatism. But economically, they are essentially state socialists.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, they relied on the political support of the urban and rural poor, the war veterans, and the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC. Former President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad is the archetype of this faction.
Right. He championed a deeply populist, state-centric economic agenda, aggressively expanding subsidies and welfare, all wrapped in this fierce anti-Western religious rhetoric.
Exactly. Now let's move to the upper right quadrant. The theocratic right. These are the traditional conservatives.
Okay, so they share the theocratic left's belief in the absolute political and cultural authority of the clerics, right?
They do. However, economically, they are totally different. They staunchly defend private property, market trade, and minimal state interference in commerce.
So they're like religious capitalists.
Basically, this faction is deeply intertwined with the traditional clergy and the bazaars, which is the historical, powerful merchant class of Iran. They want capitalism, but a localized capitalism strictly bound by religious and moral frameworks, and they are entirely suspicious of Western cultural imports.
Okay, that makes sense. Now let's drop down to the bottom left quadrant, the Republican left. These are the classic reformists, right?
Yes. Politically, they push against the absolute power of the clerics, advocating for civil rights, democratic accountability, a freer press, and a more secular public sphere.
But economically, they lean left.
Yeah.
They believe in state intervention to ensure social equity, protect workers' rights, and prevent the concentration of wealth.
Exactly. Former President Mohammad Khatami, who led the country in the late 90s and early 2000s, is the iconic figure here. His political base consisted of the urban middle class, women's rights organizations, and secular university students.
Okay, and finally, the bottom right quadrant. The Republican right, the centrists or pragmatists. Who fits in here?
Politically, they favor a representative government and normalized international relations, primarily because, well, it's good for business. Economically, they are ruthless free market capitalists.
So they are often Western-educated technocrats who basically want to implement the China model inside Iran.
Right, that's a great way to put it. They want authoritarian-leaning political stability combined with aggressive, globalized, privatized economic growth. Figures like former presidents Akbar Hashemi Rafsanjani or Hassan Rouhani operate in this space. They want to slash subsidies, attract foreign capital, and privatize state industries.
The internal contradictions here are just fascinating to me.
Yeah.
Because you can have a strict religious theocrat who governs like a socialist like Ahmadinejad. And you can have a liberal pro-democracy reformer who wants to slash the safety net and let the free market rip.
Yeah, the alignments are totally different from what we're used to in the West.
So how does a government even function when these four factions are locked in constant combat?
Well, the system is engineered to function slowly through immense gridlock. It relies on this complex web of institutional checks and balances designed to enforce what the text calls guided competition.
Guided competition. So the goal is a diffuse power semi-autocracy, ensuring no single faction can achieve total dominance and upset the survival of the fortress.
Exactly. You have democratic elements, right?
Yep.
The public votes for the modules, which is the parliament, and they vote for the president. But those democratic bodies are boxed in.
Heavily constrained. Because above the elected bodies sits the supreme leader, who controls the armed forces, the state media, and the judiciary.
Right. And parallel to the parliament is the Guardian Council. This is a 12-member body of clerics and jurists. They possess absolute veto power over any legislation passed by the Majlis to ensure it complies with Islamic law.
Which is huge. But more critically, the Guardian Council vets and qualifies every single candidate who registers to run for office.
Exactly. They act as the ultimate gatekeepers. They decide who is even allowed to appear on the ballot. If a candidate's views stray too far outside the acceptable bounds of that matrix we just discussed, they are simply disqualified.
Man, that's wild. But what if the elected parliament and the unelected Guardian Council get locked in a bitter legislative stalemate? Which seems like it would happen frequently given the factional divides.
Oh, it does happen all the time. When that happens, there is a mediating body called the Expediency Council, which is appointed by the Supreme Leader. It's designed to make a final, binding ruling based purely on the practical survival needs of the state.
Okay, but the elections aren't purely rigged theater, are they? Because the factions still have to mobilize their voters.
Right. The elections genuinely matter. The system desperately requires high voter turnout to signal its legitimacy to the outside world. And the shifts in power between the factions can yield dramatic changes in policy.
True, we've seen that. The country whiplashed from Khatami's reformist, culturally open era to Ahmadinejad's hardline, populist, economically combative era, and then back to Rouhani's centrist, technocratic push for the nuclear deal.
Yeah, it swings back and forth. However, the regime tightly polices the boundaries of this competition.
And we saw the brutal mechanics of that boundary policing during the 2021 presidential election, didn't we?
We absolutely did. The 2021 election of Ibrahim Raisi is a perfect case study for this. The regime was facing intense economic crisis and fearing a loss of control. So the Guardian Council ruthlessly disqualified almost all prominent, moderate, centrist, and reformist candidates.
Wow. They basically just engineered a clear path for the hardliners to consolidate power across the presidency, the parliament, and the judiciary.
They did. But this consolidation came at a severe cost. It resulted in the lowest voter turnout since the 1979 revolution, which basically signaled a dangerous erosion of the system's popular legitimacy among that massive, frustrated youth demographic we talked about earlier.
Right, the youth just didn't show up. And if political power is so deeply diffused and fiercely contested across this matrix, attempting macroeconomic reform must be nearly impossible.
It's incredibly difficult. And nowhere is the bizarre, mutated outcome of this gridlock more evident than in the story of privatization.
Let's talk about privatization, because the constitutional foundation of the economy originally mandated state dominance. Following the revolution, Article 44 of the Iranian constitution dictated that the government maintain absolute ownership over all major core industries. We're talking finance, energy, large-scale manufacturing, aviation, and telecommunications.
But by the late 1980s and 1990s, the centrists and reformists realized this massive command economy was terribly inefficient and stagnating, and they needed capital growth. So they pushed for privatization, arguing the state needed to sell off these massive assets to private businesses to basically boost productivity.
But look back at our factional matrix. The theocratic left, those populist hardliners, deeply opposed this.
Oh, they fought it tooth and nail. They were highly suspicious of creating a new class of independent, wealthy capitalist oligarchs who might eventually challenge the state's power. They argued that national wealth belonged to the collective, not to private shareholders.
So how did it ever get passed?
It took years of bitter political trench warfare, eventually mediated by the Expediency Council, to finally amend Article 44 in the mid-2000s. That legally paved the way for mass privatization.
And ironically, the man who oversaw this massive sell-off was Ahmadinejad, who was a populist from the theocratic left. How did he justify that?
He managed this ideological contradiction by championing a massive program called Justice Shares. The rhetoric was brilliantly populist. He explicitly promised to bring the country's oil and industrial wealth directly to the people's dining tables.
That sounds great on paper. The state proposed transferring shares of these massive nationalized companies directly to the poorest deciles of the population, to workers and to rural farmers. It sounds like a socialist dream of wealth redistribution.
It really does. But the reality detailed in the research reveals a massive, cynical corporate shell game. They technically privatized over 1,000 trillion reals worth of state assets, but true private citizens and independent entrepreneurs didn't actually buy these companies.
Right. The shadow state bought them.
Hmm.
Quasi-state entities, military organizations,
Mhm.
specifically the economic wings of the IRGC and the BASI, and those massive religious charities, the Bonyads.
Exactly. They created these complex webs of holding companies and investment fronts, and they utilized their massive capital reserves and political connections to buy up the newly privatized assets at fire sale prices.
So the state essentially just decentralized its ownership, transferring control of the commanding heights of the economy out of the hands of the formal government ministries and directly into the hands of paramilitary and religious organizations that answer only to the supreme leader.
Yes. The text labels this structural mutation the rise of the subcontractor state. When all was said and done, only about 13.5% of the shares actually landed in the genuine competitive private sector.
Wow, just 13.5%. And this subcontractor state fundamentally alters the life of the average worker through a mechanism the text calls enterprise paternalism, doesn't it?
It does. It completely changes the dynamic.
Walk us through that. Like, if I'm a worker at a massive copper mine, and that mine transitions from being owned by the Ministry of Industry to being owned by a holding company controlled by the Revolutionary Guards, what tangibly changes for him?
Your entire web of dependency shifts. In the subcontractor model, your welfare, your access to subsidized housing, your health insurance benefits, and your localized job security are increasingly tied not to universal rights-based government programs, but directly to the goodwill of your specific quasi-private employer.
Oh, I see. So you become dependent on the institutional networks of the military or the Bonyads for your family's basic survival.
Precisely. It's an incredibly effective mechanism for social control. Because if you decide to go on strike or protest against the regime's political decisions, you aren't just risking arrest by the police.
You are risking your family's health care and eviction from company-subsidized housing because your employer is an ideological arm of the state. That is terrifying.
It is. And this enterprise paternalism was operating simultaneously alongside another deeply destabilizing macroeconomic shock, the targeted subsidy reform, or TSR.
The TSR is a perfect example of how fragile the daily economics of a sanctioned state truly are. Because historically, Iran heavily subsidized essential goods to maintain social peace, right? Gas, bread, electricity, and water were kept artificially cheap by the state.
Yeah, but indirect, universal price subsidies are incredibly inefficient and inherently regressive. Think about it. If the state artificially suppresses the price of gasoline, the wealthy individual who owns 3 SUVs benefits vastly more from the state treasury than the working-class family that relies on a public bus.
Right, that makes total sense. And by the late 2000s, these subsidies were just draining the national budget, right? Consuming roughly 20% of the entire GDP.
Exactly. So the state decides to just rip the Band-Aid off. They pass the TSR, instantly removing the price controls. The cost of gas, water, and electricity rockets up to actual market rates.
But to prevent immediate bread riots, they implemented a universal basic income. They replaced the cheap gas with direct cash transfers to almost every citizen, amounting to roughly 45,000 reals a month, which at the exchange rate at the time was about 45 US dollars.
And initially, the TSR appeared to be a poverty reduction miracle. I mean, for a rural family of 5, receiving an influx of over $200 in hard cash every month was totally transformative. Extreme poverty rates genuinely dropped in the immediate aftermath.
But you cannot cheat macroeconomic reality, can you?
No, you can't.
When you remove subsidies on industrial fuel and electricity, the cost of manufacturing every single domestic good and the cost of transporting food across the country just skyrockets instantly.
Exactly. The sudden spike in production costs fueled massive inflation across the entire consumer economy. And this internal inflationary shock collided perfectly with an intense tightening of international sanctions regarding the nuclear program.
Which further strangled foreign exchange and massively devalued the national currency. So what happened to that $45 monthly lifeline.
Its purchasing power evaporated almost overnight. The cash transfer amount was politically fixed, but the price of meat, rent, and basic goods was doubling and tripling.
Oh, man. So within a very short period, inflation entirely devoured the real value of the cash transfers.
Yes, millions of people found themselves structurally poorer than before the reform, while simultaneously being saddled with soaring, unsubsidized utility and fuel bills. Domestic factories couldn't afford the new energy costs and went bankrupt.
Leading to mass layoffs, completely undermining the state's desperate goal of industrial autarky.
Yeah.
It's a downward spiral.
A total spiral, yeah.
So if we synthesize this, the state has created a highly volatile domestic powder keg. You have a massive youth demographic trapped in structural unemployment. You have a working class squeezed by hyperinflation and bound by the enterprise paternalism of the subcontractor state. And you have a political system locked in factional gridlock, completely incapable of rapid reform.
It's a very precarious situation.
And if the state has completely decentralized its macroeconomy into the hands of these shadow military and religious subcontractors, it can no longer rely on standard government bureaucracy to control its citizens. It needs a completely different kind of localized, micro-level enforcement network to maintain loyalty and suppress dissent. That's where the Basij comes in.
That is the exact functional necessity of the Basij militia. When outsiders view the Basij, the image is almost entirely based on protest footage. You know, men on motorcycles wielding batons acting as riot police.
Right, that's what we see on the news.
And while violent suppression is absolutely a core function during crises, the text reveals that viewing them purely as a thug squad drastically misunderstands their role. The Basij is an incredibly vast, sophisticated social network that touches the absolute micro level of everyday Iranian life.
The scale documented in the research is staggering. Estimates suggest the Basij encompasses between 10 to 13 million active and reserve members. That represents roughly 20% of the entire national population. The text describes it as a corporatist body.
Yeah, a corporatist body. In this political science context, that means the organization is structured to encompass, represent, and control specific professional and demographic sectors of society under the strict ideological umbrella of the state.
So it's not just a standing army.
Not at all. The Basij is not a single monolithic army base. It is intricately woven into the fabric of civil society. There is a student Basij embedded in the universities, a worker Basij in the factories, an engineer's Basij, a doctor's Basij, an artist's Basij. They operate out of local mosques, neighborhood centers, and university campuses.
So it basically functions as a state-sponsored parallel civil society.
Yeah.
If you are a young engineering student facing that 40% unemployment rate we discussed earlier, joining the engineers' Basij isn't necessarily about picking up a rifle. It's about access, isn't it?
Exactly. It gives you networking opportunities, resources, and institutional protection. The state uses the Basij to distribute vital material incentives. Membership can secure quotas for highly competitive university admissions, provide fast-track access to scarce public sector jobs, offer subsidized travel, and provide legal or financial support.
It creates an inescapable web of dependency and patronage. But the cost of that patronage is ideological conformity. Right.
Precisely. In return for these material lifelines in a starved economy, the Basij requires active participation in state ideology. They are the frontline recruiters, the local indoctrinators. They conduct neighborhood surveillance, they monitor the cultural behavior of their peers, and when the socioeconomic powder keg ignites, they are mobilized to police the society and violently suppress dissidents.
The text highlights a specific branch of this network that presents an incredible societal paradox. The Women's Basij Organization, or WBO. Because following the revolution, the prevailing sentiment among conservative clerics was that women should be relegated primarily to the domestic sphere. But the WBO actually served as a massive vehicle for women to enter public life, didn't it?
It did. It is one of the most fascinating contradictions of the post-revolutionary state. For women from traditional, conservative, deeply religious rural families, families who might have previously forbidden their daughters from attending secular universities under the Shah, joining the WBO provided a religiously sanctioned, socially acceptable avenue to leave the house.
Wow. So it allowed them to engage in the public sphere without violating conservative family norms. The text notes that these female militia members participated heavily in public health projects, like mass polio immunization drives. They gained access to higher education, specialized training, and employment within the state apparatus.
Yes, it genuinely empowered millions of traditional women. But the dark paradox of this empowerment is how the state weaponized it.
Weaponized how?
Well, This newly educated, mobilized, and empowered female militia was actively utilized by the regime as the primary cultural police force. They were used to confront, harass, and suppress secular urban feminist movements who were demanding broader civil liberties and protesting mandatory dress codes.
So the state effectively empowered one demographic of women to systematically silence another. That is incredibly dark. But empowering millions of citizens through the bossy, sending them to universities and integrating them to these professional networks carries an inherent dangerous risk for the state, doesn't it?
Oh, a massive risk.
Because you cannot teach millions of people engineering, medicine, and critical analysis and expect them to remain blindly obedient. When they look at the crumbling economy, the inflation, and the political corruption, doesn't that very connectivity and education inevitably lead them to question the legitimacy of the regime?
It is the ultimate double-edged sword of modernization, and the research confirms that this exact dynamic fueled massive social upheaval. The state's own tools of empowerment, combined with the crushing material frustrations of the youth, directly catalyze massive social movement.
And the watershed moment analyzed in the text is the 2009 Green Movement, right? Which erupted following the highly disputed re-election of Mahmoud Ahmadinejad.
Exactly. The Green Movement is frequently portrayed in Western media narratives as a purely secular, pro-Western uprising, entirely focused on overthrowing the Islamic Republic to install a Western-style liberal democracy.
But the text argues that this narrative is a profound, fundamental misconception of what was actually happening on the ground.
It is a massive misreading of Iranian internal politics. The research meticulously points out that the internal leaders of the Green Movement, figures like Mir Hossein Mousavi and Mehdi Karoubi, were not external dissidents or Western proxies. They were deeply embedded regime insiders.
They were original architects of the Islamic Republic itself.
Yes, their demands were not about tearing down the system to build a secular Lockean state. They were demanding that the state honor the original foundational promises of the 1979 Islamic Revolution: social justice, the elimination of corruption, fair and transparent elections, and accountability to the people.
Basically saying, where is my vote? They were holding a mirror up to their regime and saying, we believe in the constitutional framework of this republic, but you, the hardliners, are corrupting it.
Precisely. The millions of people in the streets were driven by the expanded middle class and the precariously employed youth. They utilized the very organizational connectivity and intellectual agency that the state's mass education and besieged networks had inadvertently cultivated.
Now, it is true that various exiled opposition groups abroad were using the moment to call for total regime change and secularization, and that was often amplified by Western media. But the text is clear that the grassroots movement inside Iran explicitly rejected foreign intervention or Western backing, didn't
They
it?
did. They rejected it because the Iranian populace harbors a deep, historically justified suspicion of Western intervention.
Right, and that suspicion is heavily rooted in events like the 1953 CIA and MI6-backed coup that overthrew their democratically elected secular Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh simply because he attempted to nationalize Iranian oil.
Exactly. The protesters in 2009 and in subsequent economic protests overwhelmingly want to solve their systemic crises themselves, on their own terms.
Which brings us to the ultimate intellectual synthesis the text identifies. Iranian intellectuals, sociologists, and reformist thinkers are actively striving to articulate what the research terms the third way.
The third way. Yeah, this is an attempt to conceptualize a uniquely indigenous form of modernity. These thinkers critically analyze the global chessboard. They reject the purely secular, hyper-individualistic, and aggressively consumerist materialism of the Lockean West, arguing that it inherently lacks spiritual community, ethical grounding, and social cohesion.
But simultaneously, they entirely reject the rigid, autocratic, technologically stagnant, and often corrupt authoritarianism imposed by the hardliner theocrats domestically.
They are attempting to thread an incredibly complex philosophical and political needle. The goal of the third way is to synthesize a system that successfully integrates the democratic accountability, robust civil liberties, rule of law, and economic rationality of the West.
With the spiritual depth, ethical frameworks, and communitarian salvation offered by Islamic tradition, they fundamentally believe that deeply held religious faith and robust democratic freedom are not mutually exclusive concepts.
No, they're not. But trying to navigate that delicate, unprecedented philosophical path while the entire nation is trapped under crushing international economic sanctions and governed by a diffused, gridlocked semi-autocracy dominated by military subcontractors. It is an incredibly perilous journey.
It is a society trying to rewrite its own operating system while the hardware is actively under siege. And that perfectly synthesizes the massive structural journey we have taken through this research today.
We started by asking a simple question. What actually happens to a country subjected to 40 years of absolute economic siege?
And the research proves that the answer totally defies our linear expectations. The country doesn't simply freeze in time, and it doesn't automatically collapse into dust.
It mutates. It builds a parallel shadow welfare state through organizations like the Boneyards to keep the most vulnerable alive. It massively expands universities to achieve self-reliance, but accidentally traps an entire generation of its youth in a stagnant economy, fundamentally altering their cultural definition of self-esteem. It attempts to privatize its massive state industries, but instead spawns a hybrid subcontractor state dominated by the military. And it relies on vast, multi-million member grassroots networks like the Basij to maintain a grip on ideological control at the absolute micro level of the street.
It is a society defined by immense, overlapping contradictions, currently held together by an incredibly complex political matrix, a shared history of surviving trauma, and a very deep-seated national pride. Which leaves us with a final, lingering thought to process.
What's that?
Well, this entire Hobbesian fortress, this incredibly complex ecosystem of survival, has endured for 4 decades by perfectly balancing these delicate contradictions. The state has historically used revolutionary zeal, the memory of the brutal war with Iraq, and the very real threat of external Lockean enemies to justify extreme domestic economic hardship and political restriction. But time is the one variable no state can control.
True, the demographics are shifting irreversibly.
Exactly. As the older generation, the generation that actively remembers the fervor of the 1979 revolution and the visceral trauma of a 1980s war fades away, the state is increasingly left with a massive population of highly educated, globally aware youth. A youth demographic that, as the text explicitly showed, views their self-esteem entirely through the lens of material success, social mobility, and individual agency, rather than collective martyrdom and shared sacrifice.
It's a completely different mindset.
So when a massive geopolitical system, perfectly engineered over 40 years purely for survival, finally faces a generation that aggressively demands the right to thrive, which part of the fortress cracks first?
That is the defining question for the future of the contender state.
Thank you for taking this deep dive with us today. Keep questioning the linear surface-level narratives you see in the daily news, and we will see you next time.